Thank you very much for coming to the roundtable debate, the first one organized as part of this year's conference. We organized this roundtable debate because we would like to show you a little bit of the feminist history from Slovenia, from former Yugoslavia, from this region. The feminist history and the history of the LGBT movement both emerged in Slovenia in the 1980s, and they shaped gender equality policies in the 1990s and later. The feminist and the LGBT movement were part of the so-called new social movements, together with the peace movement, ecological movement, and so forth. After the change of the political system in 1991, these movements encountered a new obstacle: the intense efforts of conservative political actors to retraditionalize Slovenian society. We have talked a little bit about that in the keynote debate just half an hour ago. In this sense, the progressive new social movements of the 1980s seem to have been one of the first victims of the new political order. It soon became clear that the democratic standards of an open, inclusive, and progressive society that these movements aspired to would not be the obvious and self-evident foundation of the new state. So I'm very happy and honored to have three visible actors of the feminist and the LGBT movement in Slovenia with us today: Vlasta Jalušič, Mojca Dobnikar, and Suzana Tratnik. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and thank you very much for taking your time to be with us. I will start with Vlasta. Vlasta Jalušič is one of the founders of the Peace Institute in Ljubljana, where she works as a senior researcher, and she also teaches at the University of Ljubljana. Vlasta Jalušič is the author of several books and articles on the women's movement and feminism, gender and political theory, violence, war and collective crimes, and a well-known connoisseur of the works of Hannah Arendt. A long-time activist against discrimination and gender inequality, she has been involved in international feminist networks and human rights activities. Vlasta, in line with personal is political, I would like to first ask you about your personal story of how you became involved in the feminist movement, or actually how you co-created the feminist movement in the 80s in Slovenia. Slavenka Drakulić was one of the keynote speakers at the introduction of the conference, and in one of the interviews you mentioned that it was Slavenka Drakulić texts, the feminist texts that were published in a mainstream journal, mainstream magazine, Start, that you were reading and you were inspired by. And on the other hand, you were also reading at the time the feminist theory. So what was the trigger in these texts that brought you to the feminist movement?
Yeah, you can hear me. So it's difficult to say that the trigger were really texts. I would rather say that it was some kind of being situated in a specific historic time, I would say, and being in contact with, I would say, several people who were obviously became important later on the scene. So I was reading a lot. I was reading everything, literature, for example, Virginia Woolf and Doris Lessing were my bestseller authors. And I came from this side, I would say, into the feminism, but then I also read Marx. So I was a dedicated reader of Marxism. So I started with Marxist feminism at the beginning. And as I realized, actually, you know, the Western feminism was basically at that time, the text that interested me was also either coming from Marxism or was criticizing a Marxist theory due to the shortcomings, you know, whereby Marxism could not explain the oppression of women, actually. So this is where I came from. But if we speak about the context of former Yugoslavia, of course, Slavenka. But for example, the Zagreb philosopher Blaženka Despot. So I would say that, you know, in terms of trying to think about feminism, it was one specific point where I entered, and that was when I was a professor at this faculty who was actually criticizing the emerging Marxist feminists, especially Blaženka Despot, and she had a polemic with her, and arguing, you know that we do not need a feminism. It's a bourgeois movement, actually, that women should fight together with the comrades for emancipation, etc., etc. And since I've read Blaženka Despot's text, that made me really angry. So what I did, I was still a student. So under pseudonym, I wrote a text for the weekly Mladina with the title, Where From Anti-Feminism Comes and What is Important for the Slovenian Woman. So that was, so I used the pseudonym like Marija Božič or something like that. And Mladina published the text immediately. So that was my beginning, I would say.
And you used the pseudonym because you were still a student, or there was another reason for that?
It was basically because I didn't want a polemic, or I didn't want to be recognized by a professor. I was still a student, of course. And maybe what was also important, I would say, it's, you know, my friendship with Mojca then, and our first travel to Berlin, which could also be described as a special story, I would say, in January 1985. I think my daughter was only 1 year old then, and it was the first time I left her. And we went to Berlin, and we stayed with a friend that Mojca knew, Maria. It was freezing. It was minus 10 degrees, and she didn't have heating. So, and we went out to the discotheque Die Zwei. I just remembered before, I wouldn't have remembered it without this event. So there, you know, there were, it was a lesbian discotheque, and there were sanitary, there were restrooms whereby there were dry flowers put, you know, instead of pissoir, in the pissoirs, you saw the dry flowers. So that made me really thinking about, you know, it was an experience that we, of course, didn't have in socialism, and gave me some kind of freedom to think over what I was encountered with here, of course.
There's another interesting little detail in your history, at least that's how I understood it. When one of the first events, the women-only event, was organized, you were excited, but at the same time disappointed, because you realized that, if I understood correctly, you expected something special to happen, but what you realized was the huge diversity among women which were part of that event. And it was because of that you were always promoting feminist pluralism, in a sense, right?
I think,
and that was not always welcomed by the movement.
I think that was the point, actually, when I already realized, if I speak with the modern feminist language, what intersectionality means. So basically it was about realizing, and I was working on this at that time already, because I was studying, I mean, my MA work was about the subject of feminism. So I went through liberal theory, through Marxism and feminist theory, trying to figure out what is the feminist subject about. So that was my first encounter with this non-essentialist fact of different feminisms, and where I also, it confirmed, I would say, what I studied basically in theory, you know, that feminism cannot support an essentialist subject anymore. So that was the main insight, I would say, at that moment.
Mm-hmm. Mojca, Dobnikar is an activist and translator, our second guest. She has translated some of the most important feminist texts into Slovenian, including works by Alexandra Kollontaj, Susan Brown-Miller, Judith Squires, and Bell Hooks. In the mid-1980s, she actively participated in the feminist movement in Slovenia and was one of the initiators of women's groups and non-governmental organizations such as Women's Section, Lilith, SOS Hotline for Women and Children, Victims of Violence, Women for Politics, and so on. Mojca, Vlasta already mentioned Berlin and that cold apartment where you were staying. And this Berlin really was a very influential for you. Again, I'm referring to one famous interview which you gave. The title of the interview was, "I will not stop until I have Berlin in Ljubljana." So that was your feminist goal. I have to disappoint you, but I think we still do not have Berlin in Ljubljana. But yeah, but I'm wondering again from this personalist political standpoint, what was it about Berlin that you thought is possible to bring back to Yugoslavia or back to Slovenia, or more specifically back to Ljubljana?
You didn't disappoint me. I disappointed me myself, you know, because about 10 years ago, I realized that it is impossible to have Berlin in Ljubljana. Berlin in that sense of, as it was back in 80s, when it was very alive city in terms of alternative movements, where you could go to some discotheque and you met there people who were kako se reče, punkari?
Punks.
Punks and people who wear robes after the last, I'm talking now about something that I didn't want to talk, I'm sorry.
No problem.
I went to Berlin because for the small publishing house, I had to do a selection of feminist texts for a book that should present feminist theory of that time. But when I came to Berlin, I met, as Vlasta already mentioned, this woman, Maria, a woman, feminist and lesbian, and she introduced me to a wide range of feminist projects and women's projects, from discotheques and pubs to feminist theater, feminist libraries, feminist parties, if you want, in private gardens and so on. And that was something that I wanted to have already before, although I didn't know what I want. So when I came back to Ljubljana, I had this idea that we could do something similar in Ljubljana, and we tried to do it with Klub Lilith. Klub, it means that it wasn't a regular place. It was actually a group that organized once a month meeting with discussion and then with music and dance party. Vlasta was one of the speakers at the first evening. That was the event that you mentioned before. There were some other feminists like Tanja Renner, Mirjana Uled, Rinka Vrečko, and so on, who spoke there. But out of these evenings or events, we organized a feminist group, Lilith, which was not the first feminist group in Slovenia in this second wave of feminism, but the second one, I think, because we had one before.
But it's certainly most famous now in history, Lilith.
Okay, yes.
Yeah,
I think it's also famous because we really we announced these events in the streets with our posters. This first group didn't do this. We just invited women that we know, actually. But Lilith group invited really wide wide range of, actually all women that wanted to come. And at the first evening that there were 250 women. Later on, of course, the number was became smaller and smaller, especially because we couldn't have these events in the same place anymore. But then in some gallery where we couldn't dance and so on. But I think that we, all three of us were at that first event. I think also you were there at that first event. Isn't it true? Yes, yes.
We will talk about the reaction to Lilith and how the lesbian group eventually came out from Lilith later on. A stupid little question, but so many times we are asked, so you were allowed to travel to the West, because we are not talking about Eastern Berlin, we are talking about Western Berlin. So was it really easy, or was it a problem? Was it suspicious?
With Yugoslav passport, we could travel almost all over the world. Not only travel, we could study or work in Western countries, for example. When I was in Berlin, West Berlin for the first time, I lived in an apartment rented by a student from Zagreb who during the summer was in Zagreb, and the apartment was empty. This idea that we couldn't travel, that we lived behind the Iron Curtain is wrong, of course.
Our third guest is Suzana Tratnik. Suzana Tratnik is a writer, translator, and LGBT activist. She is a co-founder of the lesbian section LL, the first lesbian group in Eastern Europe. She has published several collections of short stories and novels. Suzana Tratnik has also written extensively about the lesbian movement in Slovenia and has translated numerous fiction and non-fiction works into Slovenian, including works by Kate Bornstein, Judith Butler, and Adrienne Rich. She has received several awards for her works, including the prestigious Prešeren Foundation National Literary Award in 2007. Suzana, in one of your books, you tell us the story of how you entered into the feminist movement and later on lesbian movement. And this story is also connected to being abroad. You went to a lesbian conference in Geneva in 1986, and that conference, there were around 800 lesbians there. And you say, and I quote you, "It blew your mind." So in what way this conference was so crucial for you when you returned to Ljubljana to then, together with Nataša Sukic, who was already mentioned today, the MP, the first women DJ mentioned by the Slovenian minister, if you remember. So the two of you then eventually established the first lesbian group. Ne, spodaj je rdeča.
Thank you, Roman. Well, when I went to Geneva in 1986, I didn't plan it. I didn't expect it. I went to one of the Lilith meetings and I found an ILIS bulletin. ILIS was International Lesbian Information Service. So I have stolen the bulletins, I have to tell you now, to have time to read them at home. And then I wrote them and they invited me to the conference. And I said, well, I'm a student, I don't have any money, but I got invited. So it was really a big thing for me, though. This week I spent there in 1986 in Geneva. I must say it was the first time I saw real lesbians, because never before, I just heard they exist, but I wasn't sure if there is anyone besides me. It's a typical story of a young lesbian being the only one. And I really learned a lot in this week, because I also had this
naivety that once lesbians are together, everything is just nice and I will never suffer again. But also I learned about the diversity, about the different problems, differences between lesbians, between abled and disabled lesbians, maybe not so much the age difference, but really a lot of things. Racism. There was a racist affair at the conference, which I really didn't expect, because I didn't think that lesbians are also different. There are Black lesbians, there are all kinds of lesbians. Anyway, when I came home, I didn't do anything. I was just depressed, because I came back to my country and came back to nothing. And I knew I could have almost everything. So I think for several months, I just didn't do anything special. And then I met Erika, and she told me in Lilith that they are preparing the lesbian supplement for Mladina. And then I said, okay, I would like to work with you. And so I also met Natasha Sukic, and we all together decided, okay, we publish something about lesbians. So let's just say we already have a group and we have meetings every Tuesday, which wasn't the truth at the time, but then it became the truth.
We all know these stories about the tensions between the feminist movement and the lesbian movement, and it looks like from outside it started with Lilith, the lesbian group, and then eventually a lesbian group came out of it, right? So what was the relation between the lesbian movement and the feminist movement? Were the reason for a specific lesbian group were the tensions within the feminist movement, or that was not the case here?
Well, I think I don't remember any fights or tensions between lesbians and feminists, straight feminists in Lilith group. But I do remember that Mladina, the magazine, was writing about this every week. Oh, there has been a quarrel between feminists and lesbians, and it wasn't really happening. And yes, you are right. The first reason was that we needed time and space to do things for lesbians, because nothing has been ever done. So most of us, I left Lilith group at that time. I mean, I didn't go to the meetings anymore because I worked in the lesbian group, but some of us still went to both groups. But I remember tensions which were much harder for me inside the lesbian group, because this was another naivety. I felt that when lesbians come, we will all have same tensions. We will all think, oh, let's do something, let's do a group. But many different women had different aspirations, or they just came to meet someone and didn't want to do anything public, or they just think, oh no, we are not feminists, we don't need to do any political work, this is not part of us. Or lots of them were in heterosexual marriages, which was another surprise for me. And that was quite difficult to handle, because I didn't expect that. I was just thinking, I'm just gonna do some activist work, but then you have to deal with all those differences. And me and Natasha, we were still very young, like 24, 25, and there were a lot of older women coming and lesbians, and lots of them, they had a lot of problems. So we also have to become a kind of, I don't know, counselors or something. And I wasn't ready to do that. I had knowledge.
Mojca would like to add, and then Vlasta.
Yes, I would like to say something. For Lilith group, there were lesbians were very important. They were actually among founding members. When I was thinking about founding a new group after this first one at Sociological Society, two women came to me and wanted to talk to me. They would like to do something about women, and they were lesbians, of course. So the first three of us were from the first three of us, two were lesbians, and this is something that I always stress, because this idea that feminists are heterosexual women who have problems with their husbands or male partners is wrong. It is not all about heterosexual relationships. It's much, much more than this.
Vlasta, you would like to add something, but okay,
yeah,
go on.
I think living in socialism, and in spite of the liberal setting we were all children of from the 70s, let's say, I think we've lived in I would say one of the, in terms of thinking and also for women, one of the most liberal and countries where women had lots of freedoms in the 80s, let's say. And that was the beginning of the movement. But we were all suspicious of anyone who tried to impose some kind of unity on us, because we've lived this through. You know, we had to be, you know, brotherhood and unity. And I remember myself when I came to one event in Glencree, that was women's sections of the War Resisters International. That was 1986 or 7, I'm not sure anymore. And there were 4 of us women who traveled with the Red Yugo. There was the whole story I told once, it's written already. So we came there. At a certain point, a group of women there started to do something like, you know, spiritual and holding hands and singing together. So I never stood up in the 80s anymore when, for example, 1980 in Belgrade, they wanted to sing Druže Tito, mi ti se kunemo, Comrade Tito, we swore to you. So I would never get up anymore. So there were feminists wanting me to hold their hands and to sing, stand up, women make your choice, create the world, blah, 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 etc. And I just didn't want to. You know, I'm not doing this, you know, I'm not used to it. I want to be myself. I want to be a person. I want to be, you know, not a part of the unity which is impressed on me. So I think that was the reason. Mm-hmm. And also the question of heterosexual women who are feminists. I think this was imposed, as Suzana already mentioned, from the outside. So, and behind this, it's a story. I'm one of the culprits of this, because at this first meeting of Lilith Group, I had a speech. I was translating, because I think the issue of sexuality was something that was really, really suppressed under socialism. So one of the issues that class struggle wouldn't tackle, you know, was sexuality. So what I did was, because I was so much interested in that, I translated a text of Renate Schlesinger, Die totgesagte Vagina, from German. So for that, how would you, vagina who's proclaimed to be dead. So I gave a speech, and of course it was known. Although men couldn't come, it came out, you know, that there was a speech about clitoral and vaginal orgasm at that event. So the Weekly Mladina, which was the left liberal oriented pro-opposition weekly, led by men, basically, has shown, you know, how the left, this was how the left liberals treated feminists, so to speak. So from week to week, there was a quasi-funny part of the paper where they were mocking out of everyone, politicians, etc., etc. Of course, they've been mocking out of Lilith Club and of theory that we were trying to do as well, of course, because what was said there? Lilith Club again discussed the relationship between vaginal and clitoral orgasm. So this was going on in the newspaper for years. I think the last time Mladina published this was 10 years ago in Rolanje. Rolling on the Scene is the title of that part. So I think it was a combination of prejudices from the outside, which of course had the influence on, you know, how some women would want to appear as feminists.
Mm-hmm. So we are now talking about the second wave of feminism in the 80s, but this feminism or the feminist movement didn't emerge in an empty space. The previous political system was to a certain extent based on some kind of gender equality, the state feminism. Of course, it was framed in the class struggle. So Vlasta and Mojca and maybe Suzana, what would you say were the advantages of this kind of framings, and what were the shortcomings? And what was generally the relation between, you know, the elements of feminism that came before the feminist movement in the 80s and then the feminist movement which you started?
I think the most important thing which we don't have now anymore in socialism, at least in Yugoslav socialism, but I do think that was the case in other socialisms as well, in other socialist countries, was that equality was a value in itself. It was proclaimed in the constitution, and no one questioned equality in political terms or in social terms. So if we take a look at that, so I think that we as, I would say now, we as women essentialists claim experienced much less misogynism in socialism than we are experiencing it now. No. And I do think that's very important. This is what Marxism brought with, because emancipation of women was a part of the general emancipation, and this was so important. It was non-questionable, I think, issue. Of course, on the other hand, what we had was, you know, the idea that everything has to submit to the class struggle, everybody. So we had these several questions, like a woman question, a national question, a peasant's question, etc., etc. And we know that the only women's organization, which was fascist League of Anti-Fascist Women, was abolished in 1953 with the argument that we do not need a women's organization anymore because we need to fight together with our comrades. And it didn't exist anymore. And any attempt at separate women's separatism, it was called, was considered to be bourgeois, etc., etc. So it was very difficult to raise these questions. Of course, what we had, for example, in my generation, and I will say this personal experience, I was born into legal abortion. It was never questioned in my lifetime. You cannot imagine what this means. I've heard my mother, who did illegal abortions, how difficult it was. So since 1974, we had this article in the Constitution which guaranteed us the right. And that was so important. I could go with 17 to the gynecologist and say, look, I need anti-baby pills because I wanted to have sex. And I got them, no problem. No one asked about that. So I think this was, if I think now, you know, in historic terms, what's going on, for example, in Eastern Europe, in Poland, for example, what happened in the US, etc. It's unimaginable for me that someone can do something like this, because these were rights that were just, you know, self-understandable. And for example, when I was in the first class of a primary school, we were asked what our mothers were doing. So that was a question. Of the 32 pupils, only two mothers were housewives. So you can imagine all our mothers worked. So they were breadwinners. That was not questionable. So we had what I called emancipation without feminism, so to speak. Although we cannot say that, for example, Communist Party women's organizations were not feminists, they were feminists, but not feminism in terms of how it was understood later in the 70s, especially in the West. Mm-hmm. So this is why we called them, we can say that we had state feminists, which brought about this, I would say, legal framework that was so important for us, that we fought it for in 1991, for example.
Mojca, if I may add to this another question.
I would just say two things. I said before that the issue of sexuality was something that was not tackled. This is so important, I think. And also, I would say that the issue of of power and violence was not understood in terms of how women are affected by it. And the third thing was that a symbolic, I would say symbolic representation or symbolic repression of women was not understood as well. So these three issues, I think, were the most important issues that we tackled in I would say, our groups.
In the feminist movement in the 80s. Mojca, what was the reaction of the government, not only to the feminist movement, but to all these new social movements in the 80s? New social movements were some kind of an opposition to the official political system, right? But these movements were somehow tolerated. I mean, you managed to communicate, if I'm not mistaken, some of your requests and ideas and demands for political change also with the previous government. So what was the reaction of Slovenian and Yugoslav government?
Oh, Yugoslav government. I think, first of all, I have to say that in Yugoslavia, there was opposition almost all the time after the Second World War. We have different oppositional currents, people who wrote texts that weren't correct, let's say so. Some people were persecuted because of it, but not all of them. We shouldn't forget that in the early 70s, we had this huge student movement in Yugoslavia, which was not, in Slovenia, it was not suppressed with violence, police violence, for example. But police escorted the protesters through the city of Ljubljana. Then in the late 70s and in early 80s, we had this student radio, which still exists and existed even before. But in these years, it was pretty critical to the regime, and the student papers were there, and also some newspapers, and also some other newspapers who were critical to the regime, or at least, let's say, ironic about the regime. And sometimes it happened that some articles were forbidden, but not the whole newspapers. I'm talking now about late 70s and early 80s. So when these new movements began to emerge, actually, I should say so. In the late 80s, when according to some feminists of Slovenian feminists, the first feminist events or debates happened, the reaction of the government in Slovenia was very negative, or I could say in Yugoslavia. But then through the 80s, this attitude softened. In the middle of 80s, I would say it was ambiguous somehow. On the one hand, they labeled us as spoiled bourgeois intellectuals, but this label came mostly not from the government or some official forums, but from so-called women's magazines. That's very interesting. And on the other hand, in the late 80s, official forums at the League of Communists organized debates on feminism, and feminists like Vlasta were invited to give speeches there. So we couldn't say that we had to deal with simple oppression, not at all. It was not, feminism was not welcomed with open hands.
That's surprising.
But still, I think what Vlasta told us about this principle of equality was taken so seriously that when we came out with problems that were real, where it was obvious that are real, like violence against family, against women, for example. The regime was actually couldn't, or was so clever, I don't know, that it didn't want to react with repression because these problems were real.
But were they addressed? Were these issues taken on board already in the late 80s, or that's mostly what happened in the 90s then, in terms of introducing new policies, changing the law, recognizing the domestic violence and so forth?
Oh, changing the law was a difficult job in the 90s. I think it was more difficult than it would be in the 80s, if we would in the 80s so far yet.
Okay.
Because in the 80s, in late 80s, we wrote some demands about how the criminal law, for example, should change. But that was already in 88, for example. And it, as you all know, it was a time of big changes, and there was no time for such small problems. So
Suzana, what about the LGBT movement? Were the reactions the same? And I'm referring here specifically to 1987, when Slovenia and then later Yugoslavia faced the first huge scandal connected to homosexuality, which today is called the World Congress of Homosexuals. Maybe you can explain what it was about, but that was also probably one of the first times when nationalism really came to the surface, connected also to what happened then with the dissolution of Yugoslavia in the early 90s.
Yes, in 1987, there was, I think, the third Magnus conference. It was mostly gay men's festival organization and so on. And at that time, there was a lot of discussion about HIV and AIDS, and not many information, except for the very same group, gay group Magnus. They published the first pamphlets explaining don't die because of fear, don't die because of AIDS. They were the first one doing it, but nobody really cared about it. And it was just a cultural art and cultural festival. But then the authorities started to say, oh, this is a big world congress, and there will be a lot of gay men will come infected, and this is a very dangerous situation. And so the festival was not forbidden, but the organizers decided it's just safer not to have the festival, and then it never happened again. But there were a lot of reactions from people in certain Slovenian magazines from the very first festival in 1984, like, oh, why do we need this here? We don't need this here in Yugoslavia or Slovenia. This has come from the corrupted West. This is not part of our culture. They should be sent to concentration camps or give those homosexuals something to work on, which is not so different from today. But it was easier because we didn't have social media at the time. But as you mentioned, nationalism, there were politicians in Serbia who said, oh, this is not what we want with those Slovenians. Look at them, this is a faggot nation. And a lot of things like that.
Now that we are mentioning the rest of Yugoslavia, Vlasta, what was the relation between Slovenian feminist groups or Slovenian feminism, if we can call it that way, and the rest of Yugoslavia? Because Slovenia was not the only place where feminism emerged. The feminist movement emerged.
I think we grew out of the whole setting, I would say. I mean, as we discussed at the beginning, I mean, we've been reading, let's say, the first wave feminists in former Yugoslavia, which was the generation which is probably 10 and more years older than we are. I think that's approximately. And we had contacts. I mean, there were there were contacts, there were friendships, etc., etc. So we worked together, but Slovenian scene was the last one established, basically. So there were groups before in Belgrade and Zagreb, and there was this famous Drugca žena meeting in 1978, and several publications. I think that's also important, you know, because there were texts translated. For example, I brought here as a curiosity, for example, this is the number of the journal Marxism u svetu, Marxism in the World, from 1989, which were the texts of very many Western feminists were published. The introduction is by Rada Iveković. The postscript with the bibliography is by Lidija Sklevitsky. And then if we take a look, for example, and that tells the whole story, you know, how the whole setting was important and how there was no one face of these events with feminism. For example, we have the editorial board here. So we have Nijas Dizdarević, politician. Then we have Kiro Hadži Vasilov, politician. Milan Kučan. So the first post-socialist communist, ex-communist president and the last communist leader in Slovenia. Then we have blah, blah, blah. Collegium stalnih saradnika, so the constant collaborators, among them, for example, Vladimir Gligorov, Aljosha Mimica, Slavoj Žižek. So just to give you an impression, you know, how this worked. So we were reading these things, we were speaking Serbian, Croatian language, etc. And we were fighting actually together with other groups. Let's say, I mean, one of the most important issues, I would say, was actually the fact that the attempt to abolish reproduction rights were there already from the beginning of 80s, I would say, as soon as the debate started about demography. So that was the most important point, where Communist Party decided somehow, the Federal Communist Party, I would say, under influence of certain demographers, of course, decided that they need a demographic policy in former Yugoslavia so that we would have less little Albanians and more little Serbians, Slovenes, and Croatians. So the birth rate became the political problem. So we immediately started to react in feminist groups, and we connected with each other against this quasi-demographic problem, which was actually nationalist racist issue that was rising and which was increasing with the tensions with the Serbian, an attempt of Serbian abolishment of the autonomy of Kosovo, for example. So this is where the whole issue actually started, where the war ideology and propaganda was being created within this. So that was, I think, very important. But also, I mean, we were, in Ljubljana, there was the first feminist, Yugoslav all-feminist movement. Unfortunately, this only happened when Yugoslavia was already fading out. So there were these connections. We were publishing things. I mean, I was influenced basically, for example, by Lidija Sklevitsky, a historian who unfortunately died in the early 90s in a traffic accident, but we were working together on the issues of women's movement, etc., etc. Maybe Mojca and Suzana can say more.
Yes, I would like to say a sentence or two. We actually work together all the time. Feminists from Ljubljana, Zagreb, and Belgrade. Sometimes we found some connections to feminists, for example, from Sarajevo or from Pristina or even from Skopje, but it was already late in 80s. We had also, I could say, common projects, feminist meetings, Yugoslav feminist meetings that happened in 87, 88, 90 and 91 in Ljubljana, Zagreb, Beograd, and then in Ljubljana again. The idea emerged actually in Ljubljana, but feminists in Zagreb took it and did the second meeting next year and so on. for my, for me personal, the most important cooperation was in a field fighting against violence against women, because I always thought that violence is an issue that didn't concern me, because in my primary family there was no violence. But then when we had this first, we called it first Yugoslav feminist meeting in the second wave, let's say so. Women from feminists from Zagreb and Belgrade came with this topic. They wanted to talk about violence, and they already suggested some changes of the criminal laws, republic and federal. And after that, women in Lilith group started to talk about this problem, and eventually I realized that I was victim of male violence in my life, beginning with the primary school, where when boys sexually harassed us girls, and a few years later I experienced attempted sexual assault from an unknown man, and so on. And I suddenly connected this recollected memories with Susan Brown-Miller's book Against Our Will, that we translated in 1888 and published. When I'm thinking now back, I think that if feminists from Zagreb and Belgrade didn't came to this meeting with such a loud voice against violence, perhaps I would never think deeper about the problem.
And because of that, you also started the SOS helpline for women victims of violence, the NGO which is still working today. Do you remember at the beginning, how was it? What kind of calls did you receive? What was the reaction when you started advertising the SOS hotline, not hotline, SOS line, helpline, sorry, probably in newspapers, publicly?
Oof, I remember really very well this first evening. The helpline worked at that time from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. And at this first evening, we were all there, almost the whole group, about 15 women. And we got eight calls with all possible experiences of violence, from a slap into the face to rape. How it was terrible actually, but on the other hand, it was an relief because we feared so much that nobody will call. At that time there was no internet, there was no social media, of course. We could only publish our number in some newspapers, some women's magazines, some radios, but still it wasn't well known when we began. But as I said, we had to work the whole first 5 hours, and it was in next days it was the same thing. I would like to mention also some other thing, that we started with donated room, donated telephone and telephone line. We donated furniture as volunteers, of course, which is something I think today almost unimaginable. Today, NGOs that work against violence against women are very, very financed. They have professionals, about one NGO, for example, 25 employed people, women, and so on. And I would also like to mention that I think that this direction that we together formed actually in 90s to develop NGOs, women's NGOs, perhaps wasn't the right thing to do, because I miss very much feminism in these women's NGOs of today, especially in those who were established after 2000, when under the pressure of our groups, feminist groups, the government decided to give to disposal much more financing. So after that, many women's, so-called women's NGOs were founded, and although they tried to follow some feminist principles in work with women experiencing violence, they are actually becoming sheer humanitarian or social projects in bad sense. I mean, now social in bad sense. If you understand me, I think you do. More humanitarian than with active approach of empowering women and so on. We actually all know what I'm talking about.
Suzana, what about the LGBT movement? I mentioned at the beginning that the lesbian, but also the gay group was the first one in this region. What were the relations with the rest of Yugoslavia in terms of the LGBT movement?
None from the beginning. I think there were no groups or LGBT, gay and lesbian. To say LGBT for 80s and 90s, it's not correct. So I don't like to use it because we talk about history. What we were doing at our lesbian group, we had a lot of connections in the Western countries, like Germany, England, also Netherlands, because we needed experience from there. We also got financial support, some from there. So the change was, I think, in late 80s when ILGA, International Lesbian Gay Association, established section of ILGA for Eastern Europe. So the first meeting was, I think, in 1989 in Budapest. It was illegal meeting. And so we started to open, I think, to each other in the East. And then we, of course, there was a women's feminist group in Belgrade, and they told us they were not divided as feminists and lesbians, they just all worked together. So later there was a gay organization, Arcadia, in Belgrade, and later also the lesbian groups, and Ligma, gay and lesbian group in Croatia. So those were the first ones. And of course, we were quite well connected, and we met outside of Yugoslavia at some conferences in one of the Western countries, because we were so much inclinated to that and trying to learn and get things and do something more at home.
Vlasta, at the end of the 80s, we are faced with a very interesting situation. On one hand, we have these new social movements, including the feminist movement, which is struggling and agitating for democratic change, for the change of the system. At the same time, we have these new conservative nationalistic groups which are aiming towards the same goal, the change of the political system. What was the connection? What was the collaboration between these two camps, if there were any?
I wouldn't say that the goal of the new social movements was a change of the system as such. It was rather groups that were established within socialism that were fighting for a more democratic framework. So what we didn't struggle for was the change of economic system from socialism to capitalism. And I think that is the important thing. Neither did actually the nationalists fight for that. In fact, I would say that it was rather, at certain point, there was rather overlap between critical oppositions that came to emerge in 1988 after this arrest of the 4 people, from whom 2 were from the, basically 3 of them were actually from the movement. So the just former President Janez Janša was a member of the peace movement, and there were so overlapping of, I would say, criticism of the socialist state, and I would say also oppression of Communist Party in Slovenia under, I would say, the influence of the Federal Communist Party. So I would say that the emergence of nationalism in Slovenia was basically the result of the opening on the one hand, democratical opening, and on the other of the complex, I would say, relationships between the republics, whereby each of the republics claimed that it is a victim of the system. So the Serbs were the victim of the federal constitution, the Croats and the Slovenes were the victim of the economic exploitation of the federal government because they had to give money to the less developed regions, etc., etc. So, and this was somehow disconnected at certain point, and this was at the point of the arrest and the so-called Slovenian Spring. And that was just a moment. At the next moment, actually, the interests of these groups were immediately different, because we knew, and especially the feminists knew, that the nationalists will go and try and attempt to abolish the reproduction rights. That we knew from the beginning of 80s already. So the main point was the production of the new constitution, and we had 2 groups that were working on the new constitution, which was the new constitution of Slovenia later. One was the so-called circle around the Nova Revija, so which were cultural nationalists, and the other were the new social movements. So we had two constitutional, I would say, proposals, which were merged then at the end. And so the question of the moment when Slovenia was established as a state, I would say was the moment when I would say all these groups participated, worked together, even the new social movements groups, because it was obvious that Yugoslavia could not exist in this form anymore. However, no one wanted the war, I would say. And when the war happened, this was an event that really marked everything that happened afterwards. So it made nationalism much, much, much stronger than it was before. And it made all these, I would say, anti-feminist, nationalist claims that were, you know, that women were exploited in socialism, that they had double burden, you know, that this was just a gray time that we have to differentiate, and, you know, that women need to be women, etc., etc. So this all came to the surface much more in the beginning of 90s. I don't know if I answered the question. No. Actually.
You did, and you also mentioned a very important point.
We didn't want capitalism, if you're asking this. Many people are asking us, did you want? No, we didn't want capitalism, but capitalism happened to everyone who gave up on socialism, basically. So we wanted more rights, we wanted more democracy, we wanted, I would say, more liberties. We didn't want capitalism, but, you know, in the setting as it was, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, which happened in 1989, you know, capitalism just happened to all of us.
But what also happened at that time, at the change of the system, was the rehabilitation of the Roman Catholic Church. and the conservative groups.
But this was going on before, so they were actually screening this movie about abortion, which was propaganda movie against abortion, The Silent Scream in 1980s. They were screening it all around Slovenia, and we were protesting against it. So we knew what was coming with the power of the Catholic Church, of course.
And this is exactly where I'm trying to go: the abortion question with the new constitution in 1991. So the Article 55 of the constitution now gives the right to free choice of childbearing, right? And Slovenia is one of the few, if not
the only country in the world
to have this in the constitution, and that was such a smart idea. To push for that, particularly now seeing what's going on in the United States. Can you describe, how do you remember that time? Can you describe how you were throwing eggs into the parliament? Because that was an important action organized by the feminist groups. Allegedly it helped, and the right stayed in the constitution. But it was questioned several times later.
We had established this group, Women for Politics, where actually all feminist groups participated. So that was a huge coalition, I would say, basically. And we were meeting, and since we knew that new state will come to appear, and that was one of my, I don't want to be, to make myself as being important, but my idea was that state was important thing. So this is where I disagreed with some leftist feminists who said we are against the state, we should not fight for the state. I said, we are going to have a new state and we need it. We need a legal framework, to persist. And at the point where it was clear that the abortion paragraph was the only non-consensual paragraph when it was about to decide whether the constitution would be accepted or not. We were gathering together, and I remember that I said, I don't know, Mojca, if you remember, I said there were ideas that we would have leaflets for choice, etc. And I said, look, women, if you are not, I'm going to lie down at the door of the parliament and make a hunger strike. So I think we need to make something really big in order to prevent this constitution without this paragraph to go through. And then everybody was for this. So we made a huge demonstration in December 1991, yeah? And the constitution didn't go through, went through, but with this paragraph. And even the women in the parliament, which was just a bunch of women, even the right wing didn't protest against this. So they joined us. And I think that was one of the most important acts in the feminist movement of Slovenia, that we did this, because without this, I think we would now be in a quite different position, because we can always say, it's constitutional right, which is much higher than any other right. So I think it was hugely important. And even now, if things like in this, what happened in the US would happen, I would lie down in the front. I think that's the basic human issue. I would go lie down and make a hunger strike. And I think that 1,000 others would join me. I wouldn't just let it go like this. I mean, you cannot let it go like this. How can you do this? Sorry, I got emotional.
Mojca, would you like to add something?
Only one sentence. So many elderly women came to these demonstrations. You cannot imagine. My mother came with the bus. She lived in Ljubljana. She was 62 now. Not so very old, but to me, she seemed old. And she said, this right I don't give. Very simple. And I think that this was something that you were talking before, this sense of equality, this sense of the rights that we have and we just don't give up. This was very important, and it's a legendary moment actually in feminist movement. No?
But the Women for Politics, which was organized, was an important channel through which a lot of feminist demands then actually end up on the tables of MPs. How did it work? What were the reactions to your proposals?
This was I think these were smuggling times, actually. Women for Politics was a strategic group, basically. So it was not like, you know, we want this, we have these marvelous ideas, but it was a strategic group to push through the interests that feminist group had. So, and one of the main things was, among others, to fight for as many women in the public space and in politics as possible, and women for and the name was Women for Politics. So what we did was that we smuggled. I mean, it was still in the former system in 1998. The Slovenian youth. Socialist Youth Organization, which became later the Liberal Democratic Party, which was leading the government under Janez Drnovšek, had the Congress in Portorož. So we went there with the proposal that they should fight for women's quota and that they should have ministry for women's politics. And they accepted it into the program, of course, not knowing this stupid, they didn't know what they took in, actually. And later on, because they had this in the program and because they became the government party, we were pushing for it. And we also had colleagues from from feminism who were in the party then. So there were 3 or 4 women who were already in the party fighting for this commission. So for the commission to be established at the Slovenian parliament. Later on, there was a Bureau for Women's Politics also established, but the leader of the commission was Metka Mencin, the professor at this faculty, who was and the member of the parliament, who was one of the main persons fighting for the abortion right within the parliament. So she was actually established a commission at the parliament whereby she was inviting us. So we would be as civil society, let's say nowadays, members of civil society organizations coming there, discussing there, making proposals, etc., which were discussed in the parliament. I think that was very important at that time.
I would like to mention, and then I can give the floor to you for questions and comments. I'm sure there are some, but I would like to mention 2 other events and that were not so successful as your fight in the early 90s for the reproductive rights. And these are connected to referendums. Suzana, while in the 90s, the LGBT movement institutionalized, the groups became non-governmental organizations. The same happened to the feminist groups, working particularly on violence, as Mojca already mentioned. And it seems for a while that the LGBT NGOs are the most alive or the most productive, in a sense that they really were active in the 90s and later on. And at the time, the anti-discrimination legislation was rather quickly and unproblematically adopted. But what was then the issue was marriage equality, same-sex partnership and same-sex families. And we had 2 referendums about that. It's a complicated story. We don't have time to go into many details, but how did you see at the time? So in 2012 and 2015, we had these referendums. So basically, to make a complicated story short, the parliament adopted the change of the legislation in terms of legislating marriage for equality. And then there was a referendum, and people on a referendum rejected this already adopted law. How did the 2 referendums affected the movement in the time? How did you see it? How the movement reacted? What is your assessment of that now, a few years later?
First, I would like to mention during this referendum campaigns, I was at certain roundtable, and there was, I think, a sociologist, but unfortunately I forgot his name, and he was explaining that during the socialism, also as Vlasta was mentioning, we were so much appreciating individualism, not like getting together in yes and away from families. And this sociologist said that families were somehow more left over to the conservative thinkers in a way. But now it was like we went too far. We also wanted something to have something to do with the family. And this was like the limit, I think. But the other thing is I was not so much into this gay marriage stuff because it's not part of the activism that I really like or support. Of course, I agree everybody should have the same right and right to marriage. We have to have that. But I think for me, it was a proof that gays and lesbians and LGBT people are not quite human beings in this society. Because if we were equal, what's the problem? So this was the most horrible information for me. And the things we could hear on television and in the parliament and social media, it was like, I had to remind myself, they're talking about you as well, because I was like, who are they talking about? I mean, who are these monsters? And this was my main problem, the humanity. And I remember after the second referendum, in the morning I was listening to a song, We Shall Overcome, and I cried because I wasn't sure I will live long enough. But there was something else I wanted to add. How did this affect the LGBT movement? We are so used to all kinds of losses. So, and we can't say, oh no, we won't fight anymore, because it's not just gay marriage, it's just everyday life of LGBT people. And also Vlasta and Mojca were talking about, of course, lots about violence. I didn't get to this point. I was shocked. The lesbians I met in 80s and 90s and also now, how much violence did they have to take? Starting with their parents and sisters and brothers and I don't know, friends, everybody. Lots of them were forced to go to the psychiatrist and psychologist and so on, and many, many other things. But this is a silent violence, which doesn't mean, and I just want to say this is still going on, and this is so much important, and that's why the gay marriage doesn't work yet. Yes, of course, because they don't think we're human, not in the same way. Thank you.
May I say something? I think, and Roman, we've been discussing this before sometimes. I think that in fact, I mean, there was in our constitutional proposal, actually, you know, there was in this paragraph which forbids discrimination, prohibits this discrimination, there was sexual orientation in it. So we had this, as I said, two proposals. And my thesis is actually, you know, that the rights of homosexuals were sacrificed at that moment. On the left, liberal, I would say, they didn't go through into the constitution. If they went into the constitution, we would have had different situation, I think. But they were left out. It was then important, you know, abortion goes in and this went out. So unfortunately, this has happened, although we were claiming, you know, you claim you use all the possible argumentation in politics. So we would say, you know, they deserve it because they've been fighting for this state. They've been there in the oppositional movements, etc., etc. And nothing worked. So this was unfortunately left out, I think. And that was the decisive moment. And then the 90s were just, I would say, you know, playing within the field that was already built at the time of the establishment of the state, so to speak.
And it culminated the first time probably in 2001 during yet another referendum, and that was referendum about the right of single women for artificial insemination. That was the first referendum in Slovenia on human rights, although legally these kind of referendums are not allowed. How do you see the role of the feminist groups at the time? Do you see it as a failure because the referendum was successful? So even nowadays, single women are not entitled to artificial insemination. And in many ways that was connected also with the fear of lesbians getting artificial insemination.
Yes, and handicapped women and ugly women.
And ugly women, yeah. That was the argument.
I think that 2001 was already a time after quite some long period of the influence of what I call Western religious fundamentalism, Western Christian fundamentalism in Slovenia, which actually means that it was not just Slovenian Catholic Church like it was before in socialism, but under the influence of the international movements. So there were people coming from abroad, also anti-abortionists, and also I think that was so important for this referendum. And I think that I think that there was a huge coalition made, which was actually all people that we saw before, of course, and some new people that were not powerful enough to make public, let's say, opinion aware of what was it about, I think. And still we have this, I mean, which is a scandal. I mean, it's a shame, really, that this was not resolved later on. So I see this as a big failure, but I wouldn't say that it is a political failure of these protagonists. I do think that was a historic moment that was really difficult in these terms, actually. So I don't know. I mean, especially if you have referendum, and the fact that referendum could happen at all, that was also the problem, that it was not prohibited.
What I want to add?
Yeah, there were some other factors, I think, that developed during 90s. What we didn't mention before about 80s is that in feminist groups, there was a lot of fear from being labeled as lesbians. And interesting was that the fear came from heterosexuals and from lesbians who were in feminist groups. This fear, I think, culminated openly in the SOS helpline group in its beginnings in 89, 90. When the group almost collapsed because of the conflict around what will we do if everyone will think we are lesbians. Fortunately, we managed to stay alive as a group, I think, and we realized then that the right to sexual orientation or choice, or I don't know what is the correct term now, I'm sorry, should be something that our volunteers have to accept. If they cannot accept it, they couldn't be volunteers in our group, in our SOS helpline. But then I said there were a few other factors. I think that this trend in 90s, when feminist projects developed into NGOs on the one hand, and on the other hand, that this forums of women's politics, like Commission in the Parliament and the Office of for Equal Opportunities,
for
women's politics. First, yeah. First, it was Office for of women politics, then it was for equal opportunities, and then blah, blah. In 10 years, kako se ti mu reče, no? Je postal papirnati tiger, no?
Yeah, it was one of those institutions that the EU requires, but it is basically on paper.
But it was very, very strong in the beginning of 80s and in the middle of 90s. I'm sorry, 90s. Was a very strong office who accepted initiatives from NGOs. We worked together. We did a lot of campaigns together on different issues. And in 2001, when this referendum, the last one, was carried out, this office actually didn't work anymore, or it was only on the paper, not doing what it could do and what it had do in 90s. So I think there were many factors that helped to this poraz, kako se reče poraz? Failure. Yes.
Unfortunately, we ran out of money. We only had, money, time. It's a long day. It's a long day. But nevertheless, I would like to take one more minute to close up with your final thought in one sentence, please. Now we talked about all these memories and about this long history, and we could talk much more about that. And hopefully you will stay with us, and I'm sure that our colleagues have questions for you. But now looking back, what are you most proud of in terms of what you have achieved in your work? Or maybe what is your greatest regret that you haven't done, but you could have, or maybe should have? One sentence.
Je ne regrette rien.
I do regret something, that I wasn't more radical.
I'm not quiet.
You are not?
Quiet. I learned to speak in activism, to speak out.
Okay.
And I don't regret anything.
Okay, so thank you very much. First of all, for all the work that you have done in the 80s and 90s, and later on, we saw during this discussion how important all these initiatives were, and how they are still needed and probably will be needed in the future. That's one thing. And secondly, thank you so much for taking your time, for coming to this conference, and for sharing your thoughts and memories on the history of feminism and LGBT movement in Slovenia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roman. Roman is my success.
Kijk maar niet zitten.